Hello and welcome to the FSF podcast. I want to remind you that this is a show made by nerds for nerds, and I am Tim, the host of said nerdery. So, welcome to our kingdom. Our guest today is an award-winning author. He's a co-creator of the Lethal Lit podcast. You can also find him though working on comic books and a plethora of short stories. And if you don't know what plethora is, go watch the movie Three Amigos. You'll figure it out. However, in 2023, he won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize for mystery thriller for his novel Secret Identity. Chances are he's also written in a fandom that you love because this guy's resume is pretty impressive. And anyway,
Thank you.
I'm very excited to welcome Alex Segura to the FSF podcast. Welcome to the show, Alex.
Oh, thanks for having me, Tim. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you. I've been watching your stuff for a while, looking at your stuff, and every time I see you, I would see you pop up on Threads or Instagram. I was like, this dude's cool. I gotta get him on the show. This dude's cool. I gotta get him on
I'm
the
flattered.
show.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate
Yeah, well, it's always cool to watch somebody who's out as a creator in the nerd spaces and in creating fun things for us nerds to enjoy and discuss. So yeah. So, first question for you, Alex, and it's a question that I ask a lot of different people, but we're nerds. We love a good origin story. You've written a few origin stories, but in the story of Alex Segura, what led you to here? What got you to where we're at today?
Well, it all started when I was, I guess, four, maybe five, and my mom got me an Archie double digest at the grocery store in the checkout line. And that was my first like comic book and introduction to Riverdale and those characters in that world. And then I was immediately hooked with, I was getting digests every week or every time we'd go to the grocery store. And then I feel, you never really graduate, but I kind of expanded into superhero stuff when my grandparents picked up a reprint of Spectacular Spider-Man magazine #2, which has a great Stan Lee, John Romita, Green Goblin story. And it was reprinted in this tiny digest, which I've never seen again. I have to really like scour eBay to find it. But that's what really reeled me into superhero comics. And that and a stack of comics my dad brought home one evening that included like the second part of the Claremont original Genosha storyline, which is the most confusing, like the least reader friendly comic you'll ever find, but also like proof positive that you don't have to have everything explained to you, because I was immediately hooked and I was like, who are these like amazing characters? I want to know more. And I really use stuff like the Marvel cards, that first wave of Marvel cards, to educate myself into the superhero lore. And then I was really off to the races. Just I became a regular buyer. I'd use whatever money I had to pick up comics at my local comic shop or the newsstand. Back when newsstands had the spinner racks, and
Right.
Marvel and DC were distributed there. And then I went to college, and I was still like a reader, but I wasn't as dedicated. And I think it was after college when I realized I was kind of tiptoeing into a journalism career that I could try and blend those things together. And so I got a gig as a freelance writer for Newsarama.com, which is still around, thanks to Matt Brady and Mike Duran. And that was kind of my foot in the door into the industry in terms of like interviewing creators and tapping into what was going on from a journalistic perspective. And that led to a job at Wizard magazine, which was huge at the time. I don't think people remember it as clearly nowadays, but back then Wizard was a huge tastemaker in the industry. So if you were on Wizard's cover, your book was going to sell like maybe 10 or 15,000 more copies just based on that alone, because the circulation
Right.
of Wizard was much larger than even the best-selling comics. So that was really wild. And that was my first like in-person full-time like industry gig. So I'd go to Comic Cons, the Wizard shows, I'd meet talent. I'd sit in on meetings with different companies. I'd edit some stories, write some stories. And then after a brief like return home to Miami, where I worked at the Herald, the Miami Herald, I then started out working in publicity at DC Comics, and then shifted to Archie Comics, where I did publicity and marketing and some writing. And that's really where my writing kind of kicked in. Archie was open to me writing a few stories, and I wrote a short story for DC, but the Archie stuff became more regular. And
Okay.
and after that, I wrote my first novel, my first crime novel, Silent City, which came out originally on this very, very tiny, like almost very small micro press in New York called Cadorus Press, but it got enough attention and review attention that another publisher, a kind of a mid-sized indie publisher, picked it up and then opened the door for the rest of the series to be there. So that's kind of how everything started. And I've been lucky to have seen that progress and expand and grow. And Secret Identity was a thankfully a hit and did well. And I've been able to do a bunch of different projects for Marvel and DC and novels and comics. And it's like the longest running overnight success, I guess.
All right, very cool. Yeah, because I've looked over your resume, and you mentioned that you've written for Marvel, you've written for DC, you've written for Star Wars,
Hmm.
Archie. You have your own, universes that you've written. Um, so it's you have a very impressive backlog of things that you've put out into the world.
Thank you.
But when you were up and coming, you mentioned that you started off with Archie, and then there was a Spider-Man. Was there a particular superhero though that kind of like grabbed you and said, "This is the one I'm gonna go spend my money on in comic books"?
Oh yeah, I was always a Spider-Man guy. I was always
Okay,
Spider-Man, X-Men, and Batman in
nice.
DC. Yeah, I was much more of a Batman guy than Superman, and I was X-Men was my team. Like I was never really an Avengers kid. I mean, I appreciated who the Avengers were, but I was, if I did get an Avengers comic, it would be a West Coast Avengers comic because that's what was on the spinner rack. Everyone would grab the main Avengers books and the X-Men, so you had to kind of get there early. But yeah, Spider-Man always felt like my guy because I was so relatable. Peter Parker is so relatable, being the nerdy kid in class. I had elderly grandparents that I spent a lot of time with, so the Aunt May stuff really resonated with me.
Oh,
Um,
sure. Okay.
and But yeah, the X-Men, Batman. I also had a real fondness for Daredevil because it was, I loved crime stories, and Daredevil was so street level and also
Yeah,
complicated. Matt Murdock is a messy character in the best way, so I found that to be really cool to read. And yeah, those are the big ones.
nice. Yeah, so we have a lot of the same bases.
Yeah.
I love Daredevil. I love Batman. Huge X-Men guy. Um,
Hmm.
so growing up, if I was reading comic books, I was leaning into the Daredevil and X-Men things. Again, like you, I respected the Avengers, but I was like, yeah, but X-Men. There's the X-Men.
Yeah.
Let's go check out the
Yeah,
X-Men.
yeah. I mean, the Avengers just felt like the cool kids, and I never felt like a cool kid, so I didn't relate to them as much. But I could, I really love the Stern Buscema run. I have a fondness for the Harris Epting stuff because that's what was coming out when I was a kid.
Okay,
Um, so yeah, I mean, I would keep up generally with the Avengers, but I was always much more of an X-Men guy.
love it. Okay. Now, speaking of your current works, according to the interwebs, you have two current releases. There's Dark Space, and then
Hmm.
Star Wars: The Battle of Jakku, Insurgency Rising. And you
Yeah.
have a couple of releases yet this year to come out. The Legendary Links on November 20th, and Alter Ego on December 3rd.
Hmm.
Um, according to your Threads post. Oh no, that was an Instagram post.
Yeah.
But so I'm looking over how much you're writing, and you're a very prolific writer. You always seem to have something going, always something
Thanks.
in the books, always something happening. So my first question for you about that topic though is, so when do you sleep? I mean, like
Oh.
seriously.
um Not a lot. I mean, I have two young children, so they definitely keep me on my toes. And I see it. It's really a lot about maximizing the time I do have. So I don't really watch that much television. I don't go to the movies that often. I don't play many video games. Which isn't to say I don't get inspired by other media. Like it just means that when I
Sure,
am watching a show or reading a book or going to the movies, I'm usually doing it as part of it is research. I'm like, well, this can play into a story in this way, not in
sure,
a
sure,
copying way, but just kind of inspirational. Um, I treat it as a job, and it is a job, and it's the best job I've ever had and the best job I could imagine for myself, but it's work. And if I don't make the time for the work, I can't really do the other stuff. So I try to treat it less as not as a hobby, but as a career and a job. And that's how I get stuff done because it's also I don't have endless stretches of time. It's like when the kids are at school, I can work. When the kids are asleep, I can work. But other times, I'm really dedicated to my family and spending time with them and being present. I don't want them to feel like I'm just working in my cave and not engaged with what they're doing. So it's a balance.
Oh, I love that. And that was the actual part of the question, and you already hit it, but talking about that work-life balance, because I know that you're married and you have a family,
Yeah,
and so yeah, that's always a struggle. I think with anything that we're doing, there's always going to be that issue of work-life balance, making sure that what are we doing? Is our life funding our work, or is our work funding our life?
right.
You know? And so I think it's very exciting to hear from you that you do have that balance in place, and especially with kids. I'm a father of 3.
Oh,
So,
congrats. Yeah.
you know, but yeah, so when my kids were smaller, I was, always trying to make sure that I was there for them as much as I could. And I was a stay-at-home dad for years, so
Hmm.
I was able to really to dive into that. But what is the biggest challenge for you though when it comes to finding that work-life balance? Because you said you try to make sure that you're not doing things when the kids are awake and conscious and all these other things. But what are some of the challenges that play into that?
Well, I mean, I think the challenge, one of the things that I had when I was just starting out as a writer is that you could say, well, I'm going to sit here and write for like 4 to 8 hours. I'm just going to write today. I'm not going to do anything else. I have no other responsibilities. And this as a parent, like as you just have so many more responsibilities. You're in charge of these small people, but also their activities, their academics, their
Mhm.
social lives. And that gets more complicated as they get older. But it's also when you're in a family unit, you're also you have to engage with the people with around you. You're not living in isolation. So it's really about making sure you're giving that the best effort you can while also making the best effort you can with the work. So,
Right. Yeah, as a father of 3, I can
yeah.
agree that saying that I'm just gonna sit here and do this for however many hours doesn't really happen. There's always something that's going to interrupt
Yeah,
and
exactly.
so and especially with little ones, it's a happy interruption. It's a fun thing. So all right. Um, but it also looking at all the things you talk about being a father, you talked about being a husband, a nerd, all these
Hmm.
other things. I often find that people aren't just ever just one thing. When I talk to voice actors, they're also many are also musicians, and
Right.
they're on screen actors, or some are writers and other things. So if you had not been a writer, what other career would Alex Segura have pursued in this life?
Huh. Well, I was a pretty successful marketing person. I worked in marketing for DC and Archie and Oni and a bunch of other places. And I was also a journalist. Creatively, I've played music for a long time. I don't know if I would have been a professional musician, but I was in bands and stuff like that. I would have probably just stuck to the publicity stuff. I still use those muscles as a freelancer. It's just I'm no longer working for a corporate brand. I'm really just working for myself in terms of like managing my stuff, press and things like that. But even then, you can't do it all yourself. So it's hard. You want to kind of liaison with the publisher and make sure everyone's on the same page. But I guess I would have continued on that track if writing wasn't an option.
Okay, fair enough. So earlier we talked about, just a couple questions ago about we talked about your current releases, stuff that you have coming out.
Hmm.
Now, I think it's interesting that you have written obviously for both characters in your own universes. We talked about your private, your private books, the one not private but personal books rather,
Right.
should we say? And then you've written for characters in established universes with their set rules and guidelines, because this is what this character is, and like Spider-Man, this is who he is, this is what he is.
Hmm.
Here's Star Wars, here's these list of characters, here's who they are, what they are, and what's going on in there. What do you like about writing in each of those areas? Because one has freedom to do what you want when you want, and one
Right.
has guidelines that you have to follow.
It's a different challenge. I mean, with my stuff, meaning stuff that I own, the creator stuff, own stuff I do, like Legendary Links or the Black Ghost or the Awakened or things like that, or the Dusk. I create them from whole cloth with other creators, collaborators, and we brainstorm and come up with something completely new. Obviously influenced by other things, but there's no one that says, "Oh, you can't do that," and no one can say that because it's our character and we created them, so of course we can do that. Whereas with work for hire stuff, it's more of a challenge because you're being handed these toys, for lack of a better term, and you need to come up with something interesting for them to do, but you also can't break them because eventually someone else is going to take those toys and play with them and carry it along. And you want to make that transition as easy as possible, but you also want to make them your moment, like the time you get to use them, as interesting as possible. So something like the Battle of Jakku books, it was really interesting because there was so much established canon in that period. People say, oh, it's an unexplored time. There's a lot of stuff that happens there. There's the Aftermath books, Battlefront,
Hmm.
the novels, and a lot of dancing between the raindrops had to happen to make my story work. But that was part of the fun. Like, how do you thread the needle through this stuff that's already there, and how do you make it into a kind of compelling story arc unto itself, but also recognize and respect what's come before. So the challenge of continuity, I think a lot of writers try too hard to check every box, and you don't have to do
Right.
that. I mean, you just recognize the stories that are relevant to your story, which isn't to say you ignore other things. You appreciate that they happen, but you use the consistency of narrative to benefit you. Like, people know these characters. There's a built-in audience already. The challenge of creator owned is you have to explain everything from zero. You have to introduce the characters. So a lot of times you feel like you're basically doing the origin every time. And so by the time you're done with the origin, you're halfway through your mini series or your arc. Whereas with something like Star Wars or Spider-Verse books, or things like The Question, like, people know these characters. They're
Hmm.
built in. So you do have to explain who they are to some degree, but the length of that is much shorter. You don't have to spend a whole issue establishing what the origin is for Spider-Man. Like, people know it. And if you're buying like Spider Society #1, you probably know the Spider-Man
Right.
origin. So it's really about having fun with the toys, showing that you have an interesting take, and then telling that story, but also not destroying the toys.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I've heard others compare it. You talked about it being toys. I've heard others talk about it being a sandbox, and there's the
Yeah.
confined lines of the sandbox, and sometimes you can push right up to the edge of that sandbox, but you can't go past it.
Yeah,
And
and it's one
so,
of the things that we thought about a lot at Archie when I was there. It's like, as long as the characters are who they are, it doesn't matter what setting you put them in. You can have a zombie apocalypse, you can have them meeting Kiss, you can have them in Sharknado, but as long as Jughead likes burgers and Archie is torn between Betty and Veronica is who she is, and all these characters are who they usually are, they're recognizable, and the rest really becomes the story, like what makes it interesting. Like, something like Riverdale is a good example because it mashes up the archetypes of Archie with noir and kind of Twin Peaks and those kind of
right.
shows. And it works well because people recognize the characters and they want to say, "Oh, how are they tweaking this character that I love?" And so that's the conceit there.
Okay. Very cool. Now, when it comes to your personal stories, the ones that you write for your own universes, your own characters.
Hmm.
Now, some authors that I've spoken to com- see these two things as very similar: world building and character building. Do you see a difference in those, and do you lean stronger towards one in your personal writing than others?
Yeah, I'm more of a character builder, but I think it's all the same bucket. Like, the world springs out of character, so it's not like you don't do the world building, but I start with the characters first. Like with Dark Space, which is a sci-fi, basically like Star Trek meets a John le Carré novel. So there's a spy component, there's a big space epic
Nice.
component, like on a starship, but it wouldn't matter if you don't care about the characters. No story matters if you don't care about the characters. That's like a hard belief I have, that if and it's something I feel like as a reader, like, if I don't care about these characters, the story itself could be great, but you would lose me because I'd check out because I want to be engaged with the personal struggles and who these people are. Um, Not every reader is like that, but our stories kind of reflect our tastes as readers. And so I write stories that I would probably like to consume as a reader. And most of the stories I love are character driven stories about like messed up people making hard choices and struggling to better themselves. And so whenever I write a story, I start with the character and then the world kind of comes out of it. I don't do these like detailed world building documents. So
Right.
for something like Dark Space, Rob Hart, my co-writer, and I, we did have to really think about what kind of world are we creating because it's a whole new sci-fi thing. But if I'm writing something really grounded, like a detective story or something like Secret Identity, it doesn't matter until the character shows up in my head. Like, I can set the pieces around like
Hmm.
murder mystery in the 70s in comics. This is the conceit of the mystery. But until Carmen showed up, I didn't have a story. She showed up, and then the story started to come to life. And the same thing happened with Alter Ego, the sequel, because I knew I wanted to do another story in the modern day in the same universe, but I was like, if I don't have the character, I don't care. Then you're just vamping to make a sequel. But then Annie showed up in my head, and she had a very clear perspective, had a very clear vibe that was different from Carmen, and it felt like, okay, I'm into this. I'm excited about the story, and now I have things to explore and themes to explore through Annie, like her trauma, her
Hmm.
addiction, parenting, things that I was interested in reading about that I didn't think existed in stories that I was reading. Doesn't mean they don't exist somewhere, but things that I was curious about exploring as a writer.
All right. No, I think that's great because I think of myself when I'm reading something that it's great if there's a world built for them, but if the characters don't have any weight to them, it's hard for me to continue on with the story.
Yeah,
So,
and it is something you have to think about with work for hire as well. Like, I mean, with Spider Society, I was like, well, what's interesting if it's all the awesome spider heroes you recognize doing like Avengers y type things, or if it's a team of like outcast spider heroes that you wouldn't have first thought of. That was more
right.
interesting to me, and so that's kind of why I wanted to go in that direction. And so you have more of like an X-Men type spider team where these are the guys that maybe you wouldn't get picked first at dodgeball. You know, like if they're building like their best spider team, maybe you wouldn't pick Weapon 8 or Spider Cat or maybe even Spider Punk. You'd go for the heavy hitters like Ghost Spider, Miles, Spider Man.
Mhm.
So that's the stuff that interests me, and so you kind of you can still feed that into your work for hire stuff as well.
Love it. Okay. Very cool. Uh, so here's a question, maybe a little bit of a change of direction, a little bit left field, but
Sure.
uh, I always love to know what makes people tick and kind of how they. And that's also the reason why I asked that origin question in the beginning because I
Hmm.
like to know what makes people tick, why they do the things they do, what makes them interested about what they're doing. And one of the questions that I've used in the past, and I thought it'd be great to ask of you because of the variety of things that you've written, and we talked earlier about your work life balance. I'm curious whether it's been professional or personal. What was the best advice you've been given, and what was it?
The best advice I've been given about life or writing or both.
Sure, either or dealer's
Uh,
choice.
yeah, I mean, I think in terms of professionalism, the best advice I've gotten is to finish something, finish the work. Like it's very easy to daydream and speculate. Um, and it's also something that I was saying earlier, like treat this as a job. Don't, don't kind of don't lose yourself in the fandom. Don't lose yourself in the hype. There's going to be highs, there's going to be lows. Like you just keep doing the work. You do the work, you do the work well. You're professional, you're easy to deal with. You try your best. You try to honor what's come before, but also push forward what you're doing. I think that was great professionally. And I think in life, I think there's so much to be said for showing up, being there, being present
Agreed.
for the people you care about, being present for your friends, we're all imperfect creatures. We all do our best. We're all trying to kind of succeed in a very complicated world. So I think showing up is a very underrated trait.
No, that's a great answer. Okay, so going back towards the writing aspect of
Yeah.
things, I just wanted to throw that little curveball in there, see what we did with it.
Hmm.
Uh, but so you've written for all these different worlds, all these different universes. Is what's the white whale for you? What's the one that's sitting out there where you're like, universe, please listen. This is what I want to write for.
Oh, that's a cool question. I do get to write Batman for a minute in the first, ironically, in the first issue of The Question, All Along the Watchtower, which comes out on the 20th of this month, and I'm excited for people to read that. Kian Torme does a great job on art with Ram Fajardo on colors. But I would love to tell a Batman story. I think it's just such a perfect fit of my sensibilities and that character, just telling a very kind of period centric Batman story, unencumbered by continuity, though I know Bat continuity pretty well. Um, I would have also said Daredevil, but I'm working on a Daredevil novel, so I feel like that's kind of scratching that itch, even though it's not comics.
Very cool.
And I've written a few little X-Men things. Like I wrote a Sunspot Marvel Voices story, and I wrote a four-part Polaris Infinity comic for the X Office during the Krakoa era. but I would love to kind of just get a shot at writing an X team, or even it doesn't have to be like the X-Men, but something in that world. Like I just love that idea. Yeah, so yeah, Batman and X-Men, I guess probably would be the big white whale. I'm in addition to loving Star Wars, I also love Star Trek, so that's also something that would be fun. Yeah, those are the ones that come to mind.
Perfect. Okay. All right. So our Facebook group has we're just shy of 216,000 members right now.
Wow,
And
amazing.
yeah, it's been a fun group. We post a lot of silly memes. We post a lot of we post our interviews there for our for our followers to be able to listen to. But one of the things that gets posted there the most are those memes that are mashups of this universe with that universe.
Okay.
So here's my question for you: as using the characters that you have written, what two characters would you pick to save the universe and why?
Wow, what two characters would I have picked characters that I've worked on for other companies or my own characters or
Anything that you have written, whether it's your for yourself or a hired work.
um okay, so we Mike Moreci, who I co-write Dick Tracy with, we created this book called The Awakened for this website called Zest World forever ago, and the book is done. It hasn't found a traditional publishing home, but there's a team in it's a murder mystery. It's a murder mystery with
Okay.
the backdrop of a JSA or Avengers or kind of type team. But the star of the story is this team called the Freedom Alliance, who are very much like those teams we talked about as kids,
Hmm.
like the Avengers type characters. So I think they would do a good job just because they have a great power set and they have, I guess, the strength and the variety of character. Um, I'm also really fond of Anya Corazon, who's the part of the Spider Society. Um, I think she would be great in terms of saving the universe. And look, the question they put her on the Justice League Watchtower. She's like literally policing and investigating a crime in the place that includes every superhero. Like heavy hitters like Superman, Wonder Woman, and Batman have turned to her because they need help figuring out what's going on with their base. So I think she would be a great addition. I don't know if that fully answered your question, but I'll leave it
Yeah, I
at
think
that.
so. No, I think so. That's a
Okay.
good answer. I like it. All right. Final question here for you, Alex. And we call this
Okay.
one our silly question.
I'm
So you
ready.
can answer this as serious or silly as you see fit. And just to give you a little premise, the background of this question is Kathleen, who wasn't able to be here today, our co-host,
Oh, bummer.
has she has a 5-year-old daughter,
So do
and
I. Yeah.
yeah, and so she was out and about, and somebody asked her daughter, but not Kathleen, asked her daughter, but not her, what her favorite dinosaur was. So Alex Segura, what's your favorite dinosaur?
It's got to be the T-Rex. I mean, I always loved the T-Rex as a kid. I thought he was the coolest. I guess that's such a basic response, but in my dinosaur era as a kid, I was a T-Rex fan.
That yeah, well, hey, it's the true answers are the good answers. So I mean, I'd rather have you tell me that it was a T-Rex than come up with some weird pronunciation name that nobody knows because that was the cool one you found out about
Right.
yesterday.
Yeah, exactly. In preparation for this interview.
Right? Yeah, exactly. Like Kathleen has one, and I can't remember what the name of it is, but it's got like a cone-shaped horn on its head.
Oh,
Uh,
cool.
Paracerophyllus, I think it is.
Sure.
I can't pronounce it, but her and her daughter can because they both think they're really cool, and she keeps a little plushie of it on her desk.
Oh,
But
nice.
so yeah, so we asked like to ask that question because we thought it was rude that adults don't get to answer that question anymore. Like just because you're an adult doesn't mean that you don't like dinosaurs anymore. You
Yeah, I mean,
know?
I like dinosaurs. I'm just not a dinosaur expert.
Exactly, exactly. So all right, very good, Alex. Hey, thank you so much for being on the FSF podcast today. Where can our listeners and our followers go to find out more about you and all the work that you have coming up?
Well, thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me. This was really fun. Great questions. I have a website, alexsegura.com. You can also keep up to speed with my newsletter, alexsegura.substack.com. You can also find that through my website. I am on Instagram, alexsegurajr. I'm also on Blue Sky and Threads, though not an active poster. Like I'll post like news items, but I'm not like super engaged. I've kind of backed away from Twitter-like platforms, but I'm easy to find. And
All
one thing
right.
we didn't mention, the question comes out on the 20th. The link, Legendary Links, November 20th, and Alter Ego, December 3rd. So Alter Ego and Bruno. There's a Bruno middle grade novel I'm writing called Nightmares and Sueños, which is a prequel to Encanto the movie that Disney Publishing is doing.
Oh, nice.
Canonical. Yeah, so that also comes out December 3rd. So two novels on one day. I've never experienced that before, but see what happens.
Well, that's cool. All right.
Thanks.
Well, we will put all that into our show notes down below so that people can find you out on the socials, out on your website, so they can follow you. And guys, go check out his, if you go to his website, there's a whole list. He's got all of his books listed there. You
Thank
might
you.
sprain a finger scrolling down to go through all the books and comic books and everything that he's done. There's a really cool laundry list there. And I assure you that he has written for some fandom, some universe that you love, that you want to follow. I'm a big Star Wars guy. He's written stuff in the Star Wars world, and I'm
I
not
hope
gonna lie,
you're
that's
enjoying Battle of Jakku.
yes, yes. So yeah, guys, go check him out. And if you haven't already, there's a button coming up on the screen right now. Make sure that you click that like and subscribe so that you get notifications every time we have a new interview up, and it helps us to continue to grow and get amazing guests like Alex Segura to come onto the show and talk about cool, fun, nerdy things with us. So, all right, Alex, thank you so much, guys. Thank you for tuning in to the FSF Podcast. Until next time, goodbye.
Thank you.
Copyright 2024 FSF Podcast. Reference any specific product or entity mentioned on this podcast does not constitute an endorsement or recommendation by FSF Podcast. The views expressed by guests are their own, and their appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement of them or any entity they represent. If you have any questions about this disclaimer, please contact us via email at info@fsfpodcast.com.